Hey guys, we are back talking about Survivor 45, and it is now time to do our player ranking all 18 players based on the games that they played during the season. And this was a pretty interesting list to put together. There are definitely some placements that I deliberated over, but we'll get to those soon. But there are 18 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the player I believe played the worst game on the season is Hannah Rose, the first boot of the season. And I think what's tough about Hannah is that for a lot of the round, she wasn't going to be the boot, where despite her coming off as this weakness, and despite her and Brandon like bonding over the hardship of it all, she wasn't actually going to be the first boot of the season, as the target was more so on Emily due to her being on the outs. And it really wasn't until Tribal where she pretty much asked to be voted out due to her struggling with getting off smoking, very similar to Zayn Knight in Survivor Philippines, and that's single-handedly what causes her boot there. So I think with that, there's a serious argument for her to being higher on the list, as obviously she wasn't going to be the first boot initially. However, the more that I thought about it, I decided to leave her at the bottom as, one, the next boot in Brandon did at least survive a Tribal in a spot where he wasn't going to be the target there, and plus, Emily ends up making it very deep into the game to where I couldn't justify her being at the bottom of the list. So I feel like she's kind of just here by default, even though she wasn't going to be the boot initially. So because of that, I have her here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we actually have the next boot on the board, and here we have Brandon. And I think what's tough about Brandon is I feel like there are some serious pros and some serious cons to his game. One is that he does survive a Tribal in which he wasn't going to be the target initially. We even see him during the first Tribal trying to throw Emily under the bus and making her the target over him. So I think there's that. And I think with Hannah quitting, that obviously worsens his position moving forward, as obviously Hannah was very closely aligned with him. So obviously with that, that makes me think that he was kind of screwed over to a degree. Not to mention the fact that he was on a tribe that was very much hurting in challenges to where his own challenge weakness became more of a pressing issue when it came time to vote. So I think to that end, there are some extenuating circumstances that would cause Brandon to be higher here. However, the reason I don't is he still played the second round pretty poorly, where for one, he doesn't take the beware advantage as he wanted to keep his vote, only to later go on the journey and lose his vote anyway, so I think that's pretty insane. And I feel like by the time of his actual boot, he didn't really have much room to maneuver, where despite his previous work of putting the target on Emily's back, by that point he was such a blatant challenge weakness to where it wasn't really going to work at the end of the day, so I can't really have him too much higher because of that. But again, it was at least enough to have him over at Hannah, which is why he's here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we're actually jumping forward quite a bit into the boot order here to actually someone who made the merge, but not the jury, and here we have Sefue. And I think what's tough about Sefue is that while he does make the merge and he does get all the way to 12th place, he's still someone who is essentially at the bottom the entire time and is really ineffective in getting off the bottom. Early on in the original Reba, he's left out of the majority alliance there, and he probably would have been voted out had they ever gone to Tribal pre-swap, but they don't. We then get to the swap, where despite him being on a tribe that was majority Reba, he was going to be the target coming into the Tribal, where Jiah was able to pull in Shawn, and through that flip the vote onto Sefue, until Shawn decides to quit the game due to him feeling like he didn't have much of a shot, which in itself was kind of a wonky situation, but he would have been the target there had Shawn not quit the game, which is pretty bad. And even afterwards, people continue to suspect that he has an idol, which isn't great, and he continues to be on the bottom moving forward, but they're able to win their way to the merge. At the merge, he is part of the winning team that gives him safety there, gets through that round okay, and he's taken out pretty decisively at the split Tribal due to him being such an easy target and with him being a relatively disposable player in the game. So on the whole, it's a pretty bad game where he was pretty much on the bottom the entire time, never really had many allies or agency across the game, and he never survives a round without some sort of immunity, where obviously he wins most of the immunity challenges in the pre-merge. The one Tribal he goes to in the pre-merge is one where he was supposed to be the target and he had to rely on a very wonky circumstance and Shawn quitting the game to get through it. And even at the merge, he ends up being on the winning team, so he's immune there. And literally that Tribal where he's taken out at the split Tribal was only the second round of the game where he didn't have some sort of immunity there. So again, while he does make it further than some of the people we'll be talking about soon, it's just not a game that I respect very much, which is why he's here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone pretty similar to Sefue in that they were constantly on the bottom the entire time, and we actually have Jiah, the merge boot of the season. And I feel like a lot of Jiah's game is pretty similar to Sifu's, where on the original Reba, she's on the bottom, doesn't really have much traction there, but is able to get her way to the swap. We then get to the swap, where she is able to build a good bond with Shawn, and she's even able to convince Dee and Julie to target Sefue over Shawn at that first tribal, until obviously Shawn quits the game, which is obviously an unfortunate situation for her. But I feel like after this, Jiah plays the rest of the game pretty poorly, where despite her suspecting that Sefue has an idol, she decides to take the fall for the road vote onto Sefue during the Shawn tribal that Dee had cast, and Dee and Julie are more than happy to go along with it, letting Jiah take a lot of the fall there so that even if Sefue had an idol, they would just take her out. And there's a good chance that had she gone to another tribal, that Dee and Julie would have just bit the bullet and actually blindsided Jiah, largely due to the perception that she had created for herself. So obviously all that's pretty bad. You also have that moment after the challenge where she sends Austin and Kelly to the summit with her, and she openly broadcasts to everyone on the cast that she had done this to gather information from them, which I feel like is also pretty bad. And while she gets unlucky during her boot round that Caleb shot in the dark hit that obviously negated all the votes and caused a revote, she was still by far the easiest target left on the board, and especially for the likes of Austin and Kelly wanting to take out Jiah to strengthen their amulets. So I feel like in a lot of ways, Jiah's game is pretty similar to Sefu's, where both of them were at the bottom for most of the season, and at the time they were taken out, they were kind of just viewed as disposable people within the game. But the reason I have Jiah above Sefue is that despite her playing pretty actively bad after the Shawn tribal, I still feel like she gets kind of unlucky at points, and plus I feel like the fact that she was able to pull Shawn to her side at that first tribal is at least more impressive than anything Sefue had done in the game. And while she is technically taken out a round earlier than Sefue, I feel like Sefue would have also been voted out had the teams been reversed there, and plus Sefue was already going to be voted out at the Shawn tribal before Shawn quit, so I feel like that was enough to have her one spot higher at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we are again sticking with the post-merge to a player who made it very deep into the game, but like these other players, very rarely survives around without immunity, and here we have Bruce. And I feel like Bruce came into the season with a pretty big advantage, where due to him having been on 44, he had the prestige of being a returning player that people wanted to connect with and people wanted to pregame with, but also the upside of not having much of a target on his back, considering that people didn't really know what he was made of, and plus people kind of underestimating him considering the archetype that he fills. But despite this advantage, he is such a bad player that he ends up squandering it pretty quickly. Where right off the bat on the original Bello, he's pretty much on the bottom, no one really wants to align with him, and while it seems like Jake would have been the first boot had they gone to that first tribal, the target quickly shifts onto him to where he would have gone home had he ever gone to tribal in the pre-merge. We see this carry over to the swap, where he is swapped onto a 4-1 Bello majority, and while it's unclear what would have happened, considering Caleb later proved to be a pretty big threat almost right off the bat, we also see him getting on Caleb's nerves to where he probably would have flipped the vote on the Bruce had they gone to that tribal, and considering how he stood with the rest of the Bello members, it's very possible that they could have gone along with it just to get him out of the game. But obviously they end up winning their way to the merge. We then get to the merge where he's able to find an idol and he is part of the winning team, so he's able to stay safe there. We then get to the split tribal where he is saved almost solely due to the fact that he has an idol, and with Sefue on his team, someone who is a pretty easy target, it just made the majority decide that it wasn't worth going after Bruce at that point and just voting out Sefue instead. He then loses his vote at the final 10 during the auction, but then he goes on a bit of a comp run, winning the next 2 immunities in a row in a spot to where he's the biggest target in the game, and had he not won those immunities, he would have been forced to flush his idol there, but is able to stay safe. And then we get to the final 8, the first round since the split tribal where he doesn't have some sort of immunity. And despite him saying that he was going to use the idol for a while, he is ultimately tricked by Emily in the majority to not use the idol, to where he is obviously taken out, which is obviously very bad on his end. So on the whole, it's a very rocky game where there are very few points where he doesn't have some sort of immunity, either in the pre-merge or in the post-merge, and he obviously doesn't use his idol in a spot where he was the target, which is very bad there. But it's not just that, it's also the fact that he seems very unaware about where he stands within the game and how he's perceived, where he thinks that he has all these people on his side, people like Jake, people like Kelly, only for them to be completely annoyed by him, and when he finds this out later in the game, he's just completely shocked by all of it. So I feel like that also adds to it. And in general, I feel like he's someone who probably doesn't win the game if he gets towards the end, as really no one seemed to like him that much. So it's a very rocky game, very disappointing showing considering that he was one of the more interesting figures coming into the season, and because of that, he is here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're going back to the pre-merge, to a player that's still very difficult to assess even now, and I kind of went back and forth with them, but I decided to go with Shawn Edwards. And the tough thing about Shawn is that he was seemingly in a good spot for a lot of his run, where early on he was aligned with Zeba, and through that he was part of the majority alliance, taking out Hannah and Brandon relatively easily. But then we get to the next tribal, where obviously he and Zeba try to blindside Caleb due to him being the bigger threat between them and Emily. And obviously this is the point where Emily and Caleb flip on Zeba, and there's a lot of wonkiness with this tribal between Zeba throwing her idol in the fire and Zeba losing her vote, and then obviously being blindsided by losing Zeba, his closest ally. And obviously he would have been in a very bad spot had they gone to another tribal, but then we see him getting swapped into another bad situation where obviously he's on a tribe that's majority Reba, and it did seem at first that he could have been a target there, but he's able to build a good bond with Jiah, and through Jiah convincing Dee and Julie to flip on Sefue, Shawn actually would have had the numbers to stay coming to this tribal, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But then Shawn undoes all this by him wanting to quit the game due to him thinking that he didn't have much of a path forward. And while he later admitted to regretting this move, it's still a very weird situation where on one hand, he had the numbers to stay. Had the vote played out naturally, he would have stayed over Sefue, and to that end, he turned a bad swap into a good situation for him, and obviously he was taken out earlier than what he would have otherwise. But on the other hand, he chose to give up his game due to a misread over what was happening, where he thought he was the one being voted out despite the work that he put in with Jiah, and that he wanted to preempt all that by quitting. So to that end, I considered putting him lower due to him not knowing what was going on. But at the end of the day, after considering everything, I thought this was a good spot to put him, and because of that, I do have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we are sticking with the pre-merge, and here we have Brando. And I think Brando played a mostly solid game early on. He was obviously in a good spot on the original Bello, where he and Kelly were essentially in the middle of that tribe. And while I think Kelly was probably better positioned than he was still able to be in a good spot to where had they gone to tribal, he and Kelly were essentially going to be the swing votes in that spot. But then he gets a pretty bad swap where obviously he is separated from Kelly and he instead has Kendra, who while he still has a decent relationship with, is obviously someone he was not as close to compared to Kelly. And he is eventually taken out at the first tribal he attends. Though at the same time, I don't think he plays his boot round particularly well, where throughout a lot of that round, he comes off as pretty sketchy to the likes of Drew and Austin, where while he's initially able to build an alliance with Austin, Drew, and Emily, we obviously see Emily eventually side with Austin and Drew over them. We obviously have Drew turning down his alliance offer due to Drew thinking that Brando was setting him up to go back to Austin and Emily and paint Drew as a sketchy player. You obviously have Brando approaching Drew with his shot in the dark, which is obviously kind of sketchy, and obviously that leads to him being taken out in that spot. So I don't think he plays his round particularly well after he is swapped, but he was still someone who was in a good enough spot early on to where he was kind of swap screwed, though obviously not enough to have him too high on the list, which is why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the highest ranked pre-merger left on the board, and here we have Zeba. And I think the tough thing to assess about Zeba is that while she is the third boo of the season, she was also on Lulu, which ends up being this disaster tribe early on, to where had she been on a different tribe, I feel like she probably would have done a lot better in my eyes. But even so, she's still in a pretty strong spot early on, being the dominant force on the Lulu tribe. She's able to dominate those early votes, and she also builds a solid relationship with Kendra during the round where Kendra was on their camp after the first immunity challenge, to where had they made a swap or a merge together, they probably would have had a solid number in Kendra. So I think that's pretty good. Now I think where things get kind of tough is her actual boot round, where I think her decision to target Caleb is pretty questionable, as even though Caleb was seen as his bigger threat down the road, as we later see in the merge, I still feel like she should have kept Caleb around, as Caleb was much closer to her than Emily ever would be, considering Emily was at the bottom early on. And you also have the entire situation with the Beware advantage, where obviously she was able to get that. She ends up throwing the idol into the fire during Tribal, and she is eventually able to get it out that way, only for this twist to come into play where she had the choice to sacrifice her vote to keep the idol around to the merge. And I think she does make a questionable decision in choosing to sacrifice her vote, thinking that Emily would agree to this plan to take out Caleb, someone who she had built a good bond with during those early rounds. So I think through that, there's definitely some things you can point to that lead to her boot. She does do some things wrong that eventually lead to her downfall, but despite this, I still think she played the best game of the pre-mergers, where she was screwed over largely due to her being on this disaster tribe and her being in a dominant spot early on, and with her surviving 2 tribals already in a pretty dominant spot, and with her having potential moving forward had she survived this tribal, I feel like that was enough to have her above the other pre-mergers, which is why I have her here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and from this point on, everyone left made the merge, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 10, and I did debate this one to a degree, as I think this person had some interesting moments, but I also feel like they have some pretty massive flaws, and we actually have Caleb. And I think the big thing to bring up with Caleb is his threat management, or lack thereof, where even in the preseason, before the game had even started, people were already clocking him for being this big threat, someone who was trying to smile at everyone and smooth them all into working with him. And I think that really translated into the game, where we literally see on all 3 tribes he ends up on, he ends up emerging as this pretty big threat. Where obviously Zeba wanted to blindside him during the 3rd tribal of the season. After the swap, we see Bruce also seeing him as a big threat and wanting to target him. And then obviously we get to the merge, where right off the bat, he is the consensus target and he has to use his shot in the dark there. And again, all that's pretty bad, and that is a big reason he is taken out relatively early. But he still has flashes of good gameplay and pretty active gameplay, where early on he does recognize that Emily's at the bottom and he wants to work with her moving forward. He builds that bond with Emily that ends up saving him during that Zeba tribal, where Emily obviously wants to side with him over Zeba, takes Zeba out. We then see after the swap where he does build a good bond with Jake. Jake is someone who wants to work with him moving forward. And we see that carry over after the merge, where Emily does tell him to use a shot in the dark during that merge round, which he's able to do. And then during the split tribal, we see Jake trying to save him by trying to flip over Coutura. And while it's unsuccessful, the fact that Jake did want to keep him around is at least something worth pointing out. So he definitely has some merit to his game, and that is why he's at least this high on the list. But he's also someone that had no path of getting to the end, as no one wanted to take him too deep into the game, not even as a meat shield. And he obviously has to use a shot in the dark at the merge, which is a very luck-based circumstance, obviously, but it's still a good enough game to where I have him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I just feel bad for, as nothing went right for this person all season, and even after all their struggles, they still come up short. But I do sadly have to leave Jake here at number 9. And again, Jake managed to get to the end of the season, despite all these things going wrong for him. And in a lot of ways, I do feel bad for him for those things going wrong, and he's obviously a very likable figure, but that doesn't take away from how terrible his game is and how he managed to get towards the end, where he is literally at the bottom for almost the entire season, and he is someone who fails at pretty much everything that he tries up until the tail end of the season. Where early on, he is at the bottom of Bello, and supposedly had they gone to that first tribal, he would have been the first boot of the season. And while his position does improve slightly, with Bruce becoming a bigger target and him building a good bond with Kendra, again, he's still largely at the bottom, and he probably would have been the minority had they ever gone the tribal there. We then get to the swap, where he is able to build a good bond with Caleb, the one Lulu there, and had they gone the tribal, they probably would have been in a good spot to get to that vote, but obviously they end up winning out to the merge. But then we get to the merge, where his game quickly crumbles once again, where Caleb does become a pretty big target at that point, and while he does try to save Caleb during the split tribal, he's obviously unsuccessful in doing so, being unable to flip over Coutura. We then get to the final 10, which is really bad for him, where his entire tribe turns on him. He becomes this pretty big target, which causes him to use his shot in the dark, but even then, Kelly is the one who is blindsided there, which he had no clue was happening. We then get to the final 9, where he is once again considered a target and is mainly saved due to Kendra being the biggest threat between them after Bruce wins immunity. We get to the final 8, which is also pretty rocky for him, where the Rebas do split their votes onto him and Bruce. He would have gone home had Bruce played his idol, which did seem likely for a lot of the round, and even then, he doesn't really have much to do with tricking Bruce into not playing his idol. I feel like that was more so the work of Emily and the other Rebas. After that, he's kind of just there for the Emily round, where he obviously throws his vote into Julie along with everyone else, only for Julie to play her idol, sending out Emily. We then get to the final 6, where while he does get his way into getting out Drew, it obviously doesn't happen in the way that he wanted it to, where obviously he wanted to blindside D, and he wanted it to be like a tie vote, that way he gets all the credit for the move, but obviously D and Julie know about the plan, and through that he kind of gets undermined there. But he also ends up finding an idol during this round, which he had planned to use at the final 5 to take out D, and he's able to initially get Coutura on board for this plan, only for Coutura to later back out of it and vote for Julie instead. And supposedly, a big reason Coutura backed out of the plan is because Jake didn't tell Coutura that he was playing the idol on her, which is pretty insane when you think about it. And plus, he gets a vote at this tribal as well in a spot where he had used the idol on Coutura, so he obviously had opened himself up to be taken out in that spot, which obviously isn't great. And then we get to the final 4, where obviously he fails to win final immunity after he breaks the challenge and gets himself DQ'd. And obviously he had to go into fire against Coutura. But by that point, he was pretty much a dead man walking, where while people seem to like him on a personal level, he really had no respect from the jury, to where I don't really see him winning in any scenario, even if he did win fire and did all this stuff. And I feel like mixing that in with the complete lack of control during a lot of the game, the fact that he was targeted at multiple points, the fact that he was unsuccessful in pretty much everything that he tried to do up until the final 4 where he did want to go in the fire, makes it hard for me to put him too much higher in this list, despite him getting all the way to the end, which is a big reason I have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are going back in the boot order to someone who played a good game, but also a flawed one, and here we have Kendra. And I think Kendra's game is definitely interesting to assess, where early on, she's in a pretty good spot in the original Bello, being aligned with the other women there. And while Kelly and Brando were more so the swing votes, they probably would have sided with the women had they gone to tribal, so she would have stayed safe there. She also gets to go to the Lulu's camp after the first immunity challenge, and while she's able to build some good relationships there, particularly with Zeba, I feel like she later gets outclassed at the swap, where she should have been in a pretty strong spot to pull over Emily after the swap, where it was 2-2 with Emily as a swing vote. And the fact that she's unable to pull in Emily over Austin and Drew, despite her having this pre-existing relationship with Emily, is pretty bad in my eyes, and probably a pretty big knock to her game, though obviously she's able to scrape through that situation. We then get to the merge, where she's kind of just there for the first couple of votes, taking out Jiah and Sefue pretty unceremoniously, but then the bellows completely fractured the next round, which obviously enables the Rebas plus Emily to blindside Kelly, who is obviously one of Kendra's closest allies, and again, the fact that she's unable to keep Emily on her side is pretty bad. And then we get to her boot round at the final 9, where she was the biggest threat left on Bello after Bruce won immunity, and while Coutura, her closest ally, ends up losing her vote at this tribal, it does seem like by that point Coutura had also flipped to the Rebas, to where she probably would have taken out Kendra anyway. So I think on the whole, I think Kendra's game is kind of just fine, where she is in the majority during key points early on and then after the merge obviously, but at the same time she had additional opportunities to make inroads with people, and while she gets unlucky that people like Zeba got taken out early, which would have been a number for her, and even Caleb after the merge, I think her inability to pull Emily to her side despite her having a golden opportunity to do so is pretty bad. And at the end of the day, she only got 9th place, so nothing too crazy to praise about, which is why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Kelly. And I think Kelly played a pretty solid game considering she only got 10th place, where early on she was essentially in the center of the Bello tribe, essentially being the swing vote there along with Brando, had very strong bonds with Kendra and Coutura, but also had good bonds with Bruce and Jake, to where they liked her and wanted to keep her safe moving forward. And obviously, while they never go to tribal, she's still in one of the best positions in the game at that point. And we see that carry over to the swap as well, where she continues to have very good bonds with a lot of the people there. And while she's there for the first 2 votes after the merge, she's still in a good spot, being able to win immunity at the split tribal to take out Sefue. But I also think her losing Caleb from the other side is not great, as obviously Caleb was a pretty big shield for her, and also someone that she seemed to have a pretty good relationship with. And then we get to her boot round, which admittedly I think is a bit wonky, where she does get kind of unlucky that Bruce loses his vote through the auction, where through that the Bellows are down in numbers and essentially have no way of really getting the majority there unless they somehow pull an Emily, which doesn't feel super likely. But at the same time, I don't think she does herself any favors either, where she obviously wants to target Bruce due to him being a threat and weighing down her game, even though Bruce is very loyal to her and would have taken her very deep into the game. And while she tries to pin her boot on the fact that Bruce was weighing her down, at the end of the day, she was a relatively big threat at that point, where people recognized that she was the best player on the Bello group, and with the Rebas and Emily having the majority, it just made sense for them to go after her due to her being a big threat. And while Caleb going out in the other split tribal the previous round definitely sped up that process, I feel like regardless, she would have been targeted not too long afterwards anyway. And while Bruce losing his vote at the auction definitely harmed their chances of getting the numbers, the fact that the Bellows were so fractured anyway makes me doubt that they would have stuck together even if Bruce did have his vote. And we see that after Bruce wins immunity when they decide to target Jake instead, and Jake is completely sussed out by Kelly and Kendra to the point that he ends up using a shot in the dark. So really, the Bellows were kind of screwed either way. So to that end, I don't really think Kelly is as screwed over as a lot of other people claim, and I feel like that definitely harms her to a degree on this player ranking, but I still acknowledge that she played a pretty strong game during the pre-merge, and I feel like she definitely had a lot of potential moving forward had the Bells been able to keep their numbers. But again, considering these factors, I do have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and I didn't know what to do with this person, as I find their game incredibly tough to assess, as it has some highs, but also some lows. But we actually are jumping forward a bit in the boot order, and here we have Coutura, the final juror of the season. And I feel like Coutura played such a weird game on this season, where early on she was in a pretty good position being a part of the original Bello. She was part of that majority women's alliance that would have had the numbers had they ever gone to tribal, which is pretty good there. But then we get to the swap, where despite her group being majority original Bello, a group that she had been good with early on, I feel like she would have been in danger had they gone to tribal, where we see Jake being able to team up with Caleb and with Bruce picking up on the fact that Coutura was onto him. I feel like she would have been in at least some danger had they gone to tribal, and I feel like we even see that right before they leave for the merge, where we see the rest of the tribe looking for the idol, and after Bruce finds it, we see the other Bells decide not to tell her about this idol. She's literally the last person from that tribe to know about this idol, which I think speaks to her poor position at that point. We then get to the merge, where she obviously gets through the Jiah vote alright, but then we get to the split tribal, where she's in a pretty interesting position, where obviously at that point, Jake and Caleb are fighting to stay, and Coutura is essentially seen as a swing vote in that spot. And I find myself kind of conflicted over this tribal, where on one hand, I understand why she doesn't flip, as obviously if she does flip, it causes a 3-3 tie, and at that point they're banking on Austin to flip on the revote, which didn't seem likely at that point considering that Austin was pretty close to D, and plus even if it did go to Rocks, that his side would have the numbers over Coutura. So I understand why she doesn't flip. However, I still feel like losing Caleb in that spot is probably not the best move for their game, as I feel like it allows the Rebas moving forward to shift to the Bellows. And while the Bells fracture at this point, and there's obviously some distrust between Coutura and the other Bello members, I feel like losing Kelly at that point was still pretty bad for Coutura's game, as Kelly is someone that wanted to go very deep into the game with Coutura, even after all the idol stuff that happened post-swap. We then get to the final 9, where obviously she loses her vote there. However, it does seem like even if she didn't lose her vote, she probably would have flipped to the Reba side and taken out Kendra anyway. And in general, I feel like Coutura was mostly in a lose-lose situation at this point, where she either would have stuck with a sinking ship with the Bellows, or she would have flipped to be at the bottom of the Reba alliance, which she obviously ends up taking moving forward. And she's kind of just there the next couple rounds, where she's not really a major factor in the Bruce blind side. Obviously, her biggest nemesis in the game, which is pretty bad. At the final 7, she's not really a part of the Emily blindside, obviously. And then we get to the final 5, which is obviously an incredibly wonky round, where coming into that round, Jake and Coutura were planning to blindside D, and while she was a target at one point, by the time of tribal, she was only getting 1 vote after Austin flipped to Julie. And really at that point, it came down to whether Jake and Coutura were going to stick together and take out D. But Coutura ends up flipping her vote at the last moment to take out Julie. And this is obviously a pretty bad decision here, Now, I kind of understand it in the sense that Jake didn't tell her that he was planning to use the idol on her, and through that, she thought she was getting all the votes coming into it, but it still doesn't explain why she switched her vote to Julie, considering that she thought Jake was playing the idol on himself. And while Julie and Dee appear on the surface to be comparable jury threats, Dee is also a lot more likely to win Final Immunity, and even if she doesn't, Dee's a lot more likely to win Firemaking against Coutura, which obviously plays out the Final 4 where Dee wins Final Immunity, she puts Coutura into fire against Jake, and she loses. So on the whole, I find it to be a pretty rocky game, where while she was in a good position early on, it kind of crumbles as the game goes on, and while some of the Knock Store game are things outside of her control, I think on the whole she lacked a lot of agency during the post-merge, to where by the end she was pretty much at the bottom of the majority alliance, and she was just kind of taken out by the end of it. And plus, I'm not entirely sure if she wins a jury vote she gets to the end. I find that situation kind of hairy. So it's kind of a tough game to assess, and that's why I have it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we actually have the highest ranked person not on Reba, and here we have Emily. And I feel like Emily ended up playing a surprisingly good game on the season. Now first up, let's get the big knock out of the way. She was almost the first boot. Had Hannah not quit at the first tribal, she was going to be voted out there. And obviously, that's not great. However, she does recover pretty well afterwards, where she's able to build a solid bond with Caleb, where they're able to get through the Brandon round. And yes, while Brandon and Zeba couldn't vote there, she still would have gotten through that even if they did have their votes. We then get to the third round, where despite her having been this pariah in the past, we see Zeba wanting to target Caleb over her, to where she essentially becomes the swing vote in that spot. And while they get kind of lucked out by Zeba not voting after activating her idol, it's still impressive that she was not the target there herself. She then gets a pretty beneficial swap where she's essentially in the middle of these two sides where she becomes a swing vote, and she ends up building this very solid alliance with Austin and Drew that becomes a major force moving forward. We then get to the merge where Caleb does become a pretty big threat, which isn't great for her game, and she ends up telling him to use his shot in the dark, but also throws a vote onto him so that even if it doesn't hit, she won't be in a worse spot for it. And while she loses Caleb not too long afterwards, she's essentially a part of the Reba Alliance that is able to run the next couple rounds, where they're able to take out sefue at the split tribal, then turn around and blindside Kelly at the final 10, Kendra at the final 9, and she's a key figure in the Bruce blindside at the final 8, taking him out with an idol in his pocket. But obviously she becomes a pretty big target after this tribal from Dee and Julie, and while she still has Austin and Drew on their side, we obviously see them trying to blindside Julie at that next round, and for whatever reason, they don't end up splitting the vote here, which is pretty insane, where while we see Jake being upset when he's told that he could have been split vote again, the fact that they don't end up doing so despite knowing that Julie had an idol is pretty bad in my eyes. And that ends up coming back to bite them after Austin leaks the plan to Dee, who leaks it to Julie, and Julie ends up playing the idol, negating all the votes there, and taking out Emily with her sole vote to evict. So on the whole, it's obviously a pretty bad boot round where, again, they don't split the vote. But if we are taking that out in the first round, I think Emily played a really impressive game on the season, where she was on the bottom initially, but was able to get out of it. She's able to eventually find herself within the majority alliance, and was in a pretty dominant spot for a lot of the post-merge. And I feel like she also had a decent amount of win equity, to where had she gone to the end, she would have had a very good shot of winning the game based off her story and the way that she played the game. However, those missteps are what keep her outside the top tier for me, which is why she's here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and obviously we're down to the Reba 4, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And I actually debated these next two, as I find their games to be extremely close. But at number 4, I did decide to go with Julie. And I found this tough, as I'm actually a bit higher on Julie's game than a lot of other people, but she still has plenty of holes within it. Where early on, she's able to build a strong bond with Dee, and through their connection with Austin and Drew, they end up becoming the majority alliance moving forward. After the swap, we see them ready to take out sefue until Shawn quits the game, but even then, had they gone to another tribal, it seems like Jiah would have been the boot there, so they're still able to remain in a pretty solid spot. After the merge, they're able to take out Jiah, someone who really wasn't benefiting Julie's game whatsoever. We then get to the split tribal, where she was the secondary target by Jake and Caleb, and we even see them trying to flip over Coutura. However, I don't really knock this too much to Julie's game, considering that she seemed pretty safe regardless, as even if they flipped Coutura, it would have only been a 3-3 tie, and Austin was very unlikely to flip at that point, so I don't falter too much for this. And plus, she also ends up getting Austin's idol after he gets the full-on amulet, so that's pretty good. And they're able to ride through the next couple rounds, picking off the old bells one by one. But then we get to the final 7, which is obviously an incredibly wonky round, where from this point on in the season, Julie becomes a pretty big threat, not only due to her being pretty likable, but also from her actively building final 3 deals and people recognizing the game that she was playing. And through that, she obviously has to use an idol at 7. That's obviously pretty bad. And a lot of that came from Dee telling her after Austin had leaked the plan in a spot where he wasn't supposed to. So I don't really give Julie that much credit for saving herself at this final 7 round. We then get to the final 6, where again, she is once again being targeted by Drew. And while they are able to win the day there, it's not great that she was targeted yet again. But then we get to the final 5, where despite her being this big threat, she actually comes very close to staying, where Dee obviously doesn't want to vote for her, she doesn't do so, but supposedly Austin also didn't want to vote for her due to the bond that she had built with him. And it wasn't until the last moment that Austin recognized that he had to vote her out. And we even see Coutura and Jake wanting to blindside Dee initially, only for Coutura to flip her vote at the last moment, causing Julie to be taken out in a 2-to-1-to-1 vote. So she actually comes very close to staying, and while I don't think she does much actively to save herself in this round, you do have to credit her for the bonds that she built throughout the game with Austin and Dee, to where they were just unwilling to write her name down. And even going further, if Jake had just told Coutura that he was planning to use the idol on her, she votes for Dee, and Dee goes out anyway at final 5, saving Julie. Now admittedly, even if she survives this round, I don't think she makes it to the end, as she probably would have needed to win out, and I don't really know how good she was at fire, so I think for all intents and purposes, she would have been the final juror, even if she did survive the final 5. But the fact that she came very close to staying and is only taken out due to unlucky breaks is impressive in my eyes, and mixing that in with her active gameplay throughout the season, I did consider putting her at number 3, but I feel like the number 3 person had more of a solid backing to get towards the end, had the game played out accordingly, and plus, while I think Julie got bailed out by her relationships throughout the game, I don't feel like she did as much actively during the rounds where she was in danger to save herself, so I think that was enough to bump her down to number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and again, this was very close. I did consider putting this person below Julie, if I'm being honest, but after thinking about it, I feel like this person's game was mostly more solid than Julie's, and here we have Drew. Now again, I feel like there's definitely knocks you can point with Drew's game. I feel like in a lot of ways, he's not the best socially, to where we see post-swap where he just outwardly rejects Brando's alliance offer. And while he explained afterwards that he felt like Brando was setting him up to throw him under the bus to Austin and Emily, the fact that he's so open and transparent about it isn't great. And plus I feel like it gives Brando an excuse to target Drew anyway, so he kind of just undercuts himself that way. And plus, we see that later on post-merge, where he obviously gets into fights with Jake, and it seems like they weren't getting along too much. So again, I feel like there are definitely things that Drew does wrong, and I think he was benefited in a lot of ways by Austin being there to kind of smooth over a lot of his mistakes. But if we are still looking at his game, I feel like Drew's game is still mostly impressive. Where early on, it's him and Austin that get off pretty well. They're able to later build a majority alliance with Dee and Julie after they find the Beware advantage together. We then get to the swap where they're successfully able to pull in Emily, despite Emily having a pre-existing relationship with Kendra due to their time on the Lulu camp during the first round. The fact that they are able to flip Emily to their side is pretty impressive, and they are able to get through that Brando round alright. And then from the post-merge on, like we see the Rebas being in a pretty dominant spot, being able to control those next couple of votes. And then coming to the final 7, he had a pretty solid core with Austin and Emily that he was planning to stick true to. Now, at the end of the day, I do question whether he would have actually won that, though considering the way that he talked afterwards, he seems pretty confident that that would have been the case. And they have a pretty solid plan to blindside Julie for a lot of it. Now, kind of similar to Emily, I kind of fault them for not splitting the vote there onto Jake, though considering how Jake stood, I kind of get it, I guess. However, it did seem for a lot of it that the plan would have worked, as Dee and Julie were let out of the loop there. It wasn't until Austin decided to go rogue and tell Dee and Julie about it that resulted in the plan falling apart. And I guess something I will also follow with Drew is the fact that he doesn't seem to believe that Dee was the one to actively leak the plan to Julie, or while he did know that Dee was the one to spill the beans, he thought that it was more so an accident where Dee was just a bad actress while Julie was walking into a convo with Austin and Dee, but later finds out that Dee had done this on purpose. And obviously, losing Emily is a pretty massive blow to Drew's game. We're coming into that final 6. He was in a pretty bad spot where obviously he does try to flip the vote to Julie again. However, they're unable to secure Jake and Coutura there, and obviously he ends up going out there. So again, I feel like between Julie and Drew, it was very close. However, the reason I went with Drew over Julie is I feel like there were fewer points where Drew was being targeted compared to Julie. Again, Julie was targeted at the split tribal and was pretty much relying on other factors to save herself for those last few rounds. I feel like Drew was more so a target during the last round. And plus, I feel like there were more points where Drew was out in front in the decision making, particularly during the early merge, that allowed the Rebas to control the game compared to Julie. Whereas I feel like Julie was someone who definitely relied a lot on her relationships to get through a lot of the game. So it's obviously a very close one. I did question it myself. However, I did decide to leave Drew here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like this top 2 should be pretty obvious, and I feel like there's a pretty clear gap between 2 and 1, but at number 2, I do have Austin, the runner-up of the season, and I feel like Austin is someone who played a mostly solid game, but obviously has some pretty big holes within it. But early on, he's obviously in a pretty solid spot being in the majority reboot group. He's able to find the Beware advantage and is later able to turn that into an idol. We then get to the post swap where he is in a pretty solid spot. He's able to remain safe during the one tribal they go to while also pulling in Emily to take out Brando. All that's pretty good. He's obviously sent to the summit where he ends up with an amulet, kind of against his will as he wanted to go for the sandwiches instead, but he accepts the amulet nonetheless, and along the way he manages to find an idol as well, which is pretty good. We then get to the merge where losing Jiah is pretty beneficial for him as doing so strengthens his amulet. We then get to the Kelly round at the final 10, in which taking out Kelly makes his amulet a full-fledged idol, and along the way he decides to give his regular idol to Julie, which I think is a bit of a questionable move, as obviously I understand the worry about a knowledge is power, but I still feel like he should have given her the amulet, as obviously the amulet is less powerful as it expires sooner than the regular idol. And obviously we see Julie hanging on to this idol for a lot of the rest of the game, and he's kind of in a tough situation there. But by the final 7, he's in a pretty solid spot to where everyone left in the game has a final 3 deal with him, and it seems like he's pretty poised to get towards the end. But obviously the final 7 is also a pretty bad round for him, where obviously we see his group planning to blindside Julie due to her being a big threat, and he is the one to leak the plan to Dee, who then leaks it to Julie. And a lot of this seems to be based off emotion, where obviously by this point he has a bit of a showmance going on with Dee, and he's worried that blindsiding Dee by taking out Julie would ruin that relationship. And you also have the fact that he didn't anticipate that Dee would tell the plan to Julie, as even coming to Final Tribal, he didn't know that Dee was the one to tell Julie about the plan, which is obviously pretty bad. And even beyond that, I feel like the eventual move to idle Emily out of the game is also bad, as I feel like Emily would have been better for Austin's game moving forward compared to Julie. And he admitted himself that had he knew about the Emily plan at 7, he would have also voted out Emily, which I also don't particularly like. And I feel like it also weakens Austin's position moving forward. Whereas before, I felt like he was more so right in the middle between the Drew and Emily side and the Dee side. But through Emily being taken out this early, it basically forces him to have to deal with Dee and Julie moving forward, which isn't ideal. He's obviously blindsided at the final 6, where he uses his amulet on himself, only for Drew to be taken out, which isn't great. We then get to the final 5, where he very much struggled to vote out Julie, where while the show doesn't present it, he actually was planning to write down Coutura's name for most of the day due to the bond that he had with Julie, and it really wasn't until moments before Tribal that he finally decided that he had to target Julie. And even then, it gets incredibly lucky by the Coutura situation, where through that Dee ends up staying. And then at Final 4, he's basically guaranteed to get to the end after Dee wins Final Immunity, though Dee admitted to doing this as a way of weakening Austin's resume due to him not being able to do fire. Though at the same time, I feel like he does pretty well at Final Tribal, where he ends up getting 3 votes, even flipping Kendra's vote, where Kendra admitted that she was going to vote for Dee coming into Final Tribal, but through Austin's performance ended up flipping. And while Jake would have voted for Dee had it come to a tie, the fact that Austin was at least competitive at the end against Dee is pretty impressive in my eyes. So I feel like compared to other runner-ups in Survivor history, I find Austin's game to be pretty impressive in my eyes, where he was essentially in the majority alliance for almost the entire game, And while there were missteps towards the endgame that resulted in him being out of the loop for key votes, he was never in serious danger of going home, which admittedly cannot be said for the number one person. And it's pretty impressive that he was still able to get 3 votes at the end, flipping one along the way. And I still find Austin to be a mostly solid player survivor. But again, he still ended up losing by the end, and I feel like he kind of let his emotions get the better of him by the end of it, which is why he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on Survivor 45 is the winner of the season, and here we have D. And I think D is the best winner of the new era by a good amount. Or even though Jam Jam was obviously part of a dominant group for most of the season, I feel like D was more dominant within her alliance compared to Jam Jam. And I feel like there were fewer points where she was targeted, even though there were some missteps along the way. But if we are looking at her game, she's obviously in a pretty solid spot early on, being part of the original Reba alliance that's able to dominate the early game. She then gets a pretty good swap where she's able to be in the majority there. Although I will say that the Shawn tribal itself is kind of wonky, where she obviously ends up throwing her vote on the sefue, even though Shawn had already agreed to quit the game. And plus Shawn ends up throwing his vote onto her, which isn't great, but obviously she was pretty safe for that round anyway. But while I would knock her sefue vote itself, for it being more the result of stubbornness than anything else, as we later see sefue going on a witch hunt over it, I think D recovers pretty well from it, where Jiah, for whatever reason, decides to take the fall for this vote. And I feel like that's pretty impressive as we see D and Julie going along with this, especially with the perception that sefue has an idol to where they could easily take out Jiah if it came down to it. Though obviously they're able to make their way to the merge. And then after the merge, we really see the Rebas taking control, taking out a lot of the outsiders along the way. And while I wouldn't say she's dictating what the alliance is doing per se, as I feel like a lot of them are working together during a lot of the early merge, she's still in a pretty powerful position to where, despite people viewing her as this big threat, there was just no way to get D out, as she was very well positioned for a lot of it, which I find pretty impressive. I feel like it's not until the final 7 where D really starts to take the reins on the game, where obviously this is the round where Drew is plotting this blindside against Julie, and the plan was to leave D out of this, until Austin ends up leaking the plan to her due to their relationship, where obviously by that point they had a very strong relationship, and Austin didn't want to harm it by blindsiding her, which leads to him telling her about this plan, and she ends up telling Julie about it and encouraging her to play the idol on herself, all while she throws a vote onto Julie so that she has some cover in case it doesn't go through. And through this, they end up taking out Emily, which is a pretty massive move for D, as it takes out Emily, someone who's a pretty big threat in the game. It leaves Julie in the game, someone who's still a bigger target ahead of her and someone for Drew to focus on. It also weakens Drew to where he's the very clear next boot. And it also forces Austin to have to work with her moving forward versus with Drew. So I feel like all in all, it's a very impressive move. And then obviously we see at the final 6 where they are able to take out Drew. And I feel like up until the final 5, D had been playing a pretty dominant game and had put herself in a pretty strong position to ride her way to the end. But with that said, we get to the final 5, which I think is the biggest knock to her game. I feel like the final 5 round is terrible for D, where she comes very close to going home with Coutura and Jake wanting to target her, all while D refuses to write down Julie's name, even knowing that Julie is one of her biggest threats left in the game. Like, her bond with Julie is so strong that she just refuses to write down Julie's name, even to the point where she has a meltdown in the middle of tribal council there, which is pretty bad. Not to mention the fact that Austin was also not willing to vote down Julie for most of the round, and it really wasn't until the last moment that he changed his mind as well. And all this is going on while Jake and Coutura are plotting her demise here, and she has no idea it's coming. We're coming into this tribal, Jake and Coutura were planning to vote for D, and had all the other votes played out accordingly, D would have gone home here. And she really gets lucky that Coutura flips her vote at the last minute, due to Jake not telling Coutura that he was planning to use his idol onto her. Where had Jake done that, Coutura probably keeps her vote onto D, and D goes home at that tribal. But even aside from that, if Austin doesn't flip his vote from Coutura to Julie, and Jake plays his idol on Coutura, that results in a 1-to-1-to-1 tie, where Coutura and Jake are the tiebreakers, and D goes home in that situation anyway. So she really gets lucky at this tribal, as she really gets saved by things completely outside of her control. Really a terrible moment here from what's otherwise a pretty solid game. And then we get to the final four where she does win final immunity, which admittedly is fine as Austin also would have taken her had he won final immunity. But then we get the final tribal where it ends up being a close vote where Dee only wins 5-3, and she even loses Kendra's vote during final tribal where Kendra had come into that final tribal wanting to vote for Dee but flips to Austin during it. And obviously that's not great. And while Jake would have voted for her had Austin gotten one more vote and tied, it's still not great that she doesn't win more convincingly than other New Era winners, but I feel like all things considered, Dee is still an extremely impressive winner, the best of the New Era by a good amount, and if we are taking out the Final 5 round, it is an extremely dominant game. I feel like I would have her relatively high on a winner ranking for that reason, and I feel like she clearly played the best game of the season by a good amount. So because of that, I have her here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now you'll be doing a 45 review that'll be coming out soon, so you can look forward to that. After that, I'll be doing my 2023 Survivor Gumball Awards, so you can look forward to that. And obviously with the new year coming, expect new content on this channel moving forward. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.